this would actually become known and theorized by Kwame Nkrumah himself as neocolonialism, which we'll constantly return to, and we're living in a very neocolonial moment right now. So, the United States emerged as the newly dominant imperial colonial power in the world system, and it sought to actually control the process of decolonization, materially and discursively. By laying claim to the language of anti-colonial struggle, particularly in the early 1960s under Kennedy and later under Johnson, they used the origin myth of the American three-case revolution, and there was a proliferation of imperial academic work which actually justified the United States stewardship of decolonization or resolving underdevelopment through so-called modernization. This is where modernization theory comes from. And through this various means of neocolonial control, which embraced the so-called colonial comparison, the American government and civil society practiced forms of colonial policy making and warfare domestically and internationally to maintain and deepen their hegemony in the world system.
Before we continue, could you explain what modernization theory argued?
Sure. Modernization theory is a theory that kind of argues that the best way for states to achieve independence, to decolonize,
I love how they just randomly assign me a black person.
Themselves.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I
their underdevelopment.
Don't know what happened actually. I think because Cities 2 has a bunch of uploads and updates and other stupid shit. It froze my computer, so I had to restart it.
The techniques, the policies, the practices, the culture of the West, of capitalist.
It's entirely my fault, just like everything else that goes wrong in my life.
Depending on how you want to put it.
Yeah, and I would just add in, there was this idea that there's one, like, it's like a linear model of development. That not even that they're underdeveloped, that they're just like at an earlier phase. Like at one point, the U.S. was where you are to Philippines or whatever, and as long as you just take these steps, I think what's his name, E.R. Rostow, something Rostow, W.W. Rostow had the stage of development, or the 5 stages of growth, and had specifically points where you kind of launch off and you're now fully fledged independent or fully fledged developed.
So yeah, I think it's really important to see this theory, which, if you read any of the debates in political economy, even radical political economy of the time, they all
love these mountains and hills and rivers.
Theory. It's important to recognize this theory as a form of attempted furthering of imperialism, of furthering of colonial control through academia, through this theory that becomes broadly popularized and influences the development policies of many social formations that are attempting to decolonize. So with all of these interactions and attempts at pacification,
it's good. It's good that you went outside. Don't just sit and look at people like me all day. Don't do that. It's bad for your health and bad for your politics. I'm kidding.
Transformation in the formerly colonized world than you could even see in Ghana or Tanzania, even though Tanzania tried to catch up, and Ghana suffered a coup d'état of Nkrumah, which plunged them back into a military dictatorship. In any case, these victories would help to initiate a more and more radical analysis of what was to be done to ensure Black self-determination through the keen and individual and collective study of Black intellectuals and organizers in the United States. So you had everyone from James Baldwin to the late-in-life Du Bois to St. Clair Drake, who's a forgotten and really important figure in Pan-Africanism, George Padmore, to intellectuals such as
former Trump,
and we'll be talking about Robert Allen. You had Kwame Ture. Yeah, you had so many people like really advancing and beginning this really radical analysis, and they're like looking at these lessons of third world struggles for decolonization, which forced more radical maneuvers and transformative practices. And these things would be taken more and more as a guide, as an inspiration, and really as analytical points of departure for Black people in the so-called United States. The internal colonial theory would be refined to a great extent, but also
Noob Kingdom, Nubian. I don't think Tora would appreciate you calling her kingdom one of noobs. You'd probably put an arrow through your hair.
This sort of radical and revolutionary analysis, which would lead to practice. So by the early 1970s, there would be a really salient theorization of the political economy of Black existence, alongside a more and more keen understanding of the Black working class and the Black lumpen role as the most potent revolutionary subjects in the so-called United States. And this was coming into conflict with these hegemonic attempts at partial incorporation of Black or New African people as the Republic of New Africa, a revolutionary Black nationalist organization that had its own conception of internal colonial theory. The government would attempt these partial incorporation under the guise of pluralistic or interest group politics, which is how you get to the present moment where you have Kamala Harris having these, trying to appeal to quote unquote Black voters as if Black voters exist as part of the polity as such, as part of the political life of the United States rather than as an oppressed nation within the so-called United States.
In some ways, this is a rearticulation of integration.
Yeah, or really it's unfortunately the, for the moment, victory of integration politics, which was a counter-revolutionary policy. It's a neo-colonial policy, as we'll come to understand as we get into this analysis. But just briefly, before we start with some definitions, I want to say that there's this constant tension, and you'll even see it in some of the definitions, between internal colonialism as an analogy, so analogizing the struggle of oppressed people in the United States to those of the colonized, and as an analytic rather than disrupting and destroying that supposed
lovely. Go away.
uniqueness or set-asidedness of the condition of life in the United States, of the social formation of the United States, and really saying, well, the United States is a settler colony just like other settler colonies. It's an empire like other empires throughout world history, and the way that it functions is no different. And so we need to analyze that function in the same way we would analyze functions elsewhere, while keeping in mind the particular historic particularities of the so-called United States.
So to begin with definitions,
a Viking. Fuck off.
A definition from Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton in Black Power. And they write, quote, "There is no, quote, American, with 3 Ks, dilemma, because Black people in this country form a colony, and it is not in the interest of the colonial power to liberate them. Black people are legal citizens of the United States, with, for the most part, the same legal rights as other citizens. Yet they stand as colonial subjects in relation to the white society. Thus, institutional racism has another name, colonialism."
And I think this is really important because often in very surface level treatments of Ture and Hamilton's sort of seminal work here, people pull this as a definition of institutional racism, which becomes structural racism, which becomes something everyone in any liberal arts class talks about. But really, they're making a very salient point here where they're saying institutional racism is colonialism. And what do you do about colonialism? It's very different than what you do about a structural.
This is a really, really good runes. A really, really good discussion, because it's a very common one in DSA. Like, people are always talking about, we have to stop institutional racism. Like, people in DSA generally don't like hearing the word colonialism because I guess it frightens them. Or, like Nate just said, the way in which you address colonialism is radically different. Like, you can reform away institutional racism, or so people think. You can reform away all these other bad institutional whatevers, but colonialism is something that you overthrow with armed force. That's why people in white left organizations are afraid to discuss colonialism, because the ramifications are too much for their little reformist heads to comprehend. That's why we have to continue to politically educate our comrades and turn them into very, very good enemies of America, as opposed to simply allowing them to continue to be American.
Issue that you have the capacity to resolve with regard to internal politics.
And he was like a professor at Columbia.
Yeah,
or
he's
something.
like a political science professor.
Yeah, if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. It reads like how Kwame Ture would speak. And for those who aren't familiar, also that you should do yourself a favor and watch some of Kwame Ture's speeches.
I force you all to watch Kwame Ture's speeches.
But
look, if you watch me, you have no excuse to be stupid.
Black Power came out in 1967, and so in the afterword, in 1992, by Kwame Ture, he adds, quote, "Many have attacked at our analogy of regarding the African communities as colonies. Imperialism, trying to preserve itself in the face of the oppressed masses, this anti-colonial struggle, presented neo-colonialism to the masses. Neo-colonialism means powerless visibility. You see an African president, hint, we have Kamala, but the entire country is controlled by France or Belgium. Oh wait, sorry. Let me. That doesn't make as much sense in that context. I didn't read the whole thing. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Neocolonialism means powerless visibility. You see an African president.
Neocolonialism means powerless visibility. What did we just say about power?
Its formal colonial master. In Los Angeles, after 27 years of reform, or colonial independence, and with an African mayor who was a lieutenant in the police force, racist police terrorism increases. If this is not raw neocolonialism, what is? This analogy should not allow us to lose sight of the fact that the USA is a settler colony. Only the indigenous people are its just owners. End quote.
So I think that's really powerful, and it's very powerful in that Kwame Ture is writing this in 1992. And I think if you watch a lot of his speeches on YouTube, he's really carrying the banner for an anti-colonial, revolutionary black internationalist Pan-African politics well throughout the 1990s, a period when this is, you know, you have TINA, there is no other alternative. You have the end of the Cold War. You have a lot of people not really talking about things in these terms. And I think that's just really important to think about historically.
And TINA here, there is no alternative, was from Margaret Thatcher, 1980s, to Reagan in the so-called U.S., for those who haven't heard that phrase. And this was the idea of there is no alternative to accepting capitalism as hegemonic or as the only option for the world.
The next definition I have is from Harold Cruse, who wrote this book called The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. But this is actually from a later book called Rebellion or Revolution. He's a intellectual college professor. I think he was a theater person as well. But he became really famous for his role in Black Power and his role in theorizing internal colonial analysis. So, quote, "From the beginning, the American Negro has existed as a colonial being. His enslavement coincided with the colonial expansion of European powers and was nothing more or less than a condition of domestic colonialism. Instead of the United States establishing a colonial empire in Africa, it brought the colonial system home and installed it in the southern states. Emancipation elevated black men to only the position of a semi-dependent man, not to that of an equal or independent being." And he continues to say this: "The belief of some American Marxists in a political alliance of Negroes and whites is based on a superficial assessment of the Negro's social status. The notion that the Negro is an integral part of the American nation in the same way as was the white working class." So again, you have this separation and distinction, this understanding of the colonial condition of black New African life, and you cannot judge or even analyze or assess the black working class as part of this broad, amalgamated multiracial working class. It's a colonial subject population that has its own path to attaining political independence and sovereignty.
Yeah. Do you know what year Rebellion or Revolution came out?
This is comrades Nate and Joma from JDPod. JDPOD.
Okay, so we're still in this moment, right? Black Power, 1967, Rebellion and Revolution, 1968, and this is situated amongst the rise of Black Power in the U.S., in the so-called U.S., but also, quote unquote, the Global 68. To bring back to the Philippine context, the start of the formation of the National Democratic Movement, the Indy Movement, the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New People's Army, was founded the next year in 1969. We could go around the world and start naming these different, the PFLP, etc. Yeah,
it's what the quote we started this with. You know, the Black Revolution is sweeping Asia, it's sweeping Latin America, it's sweeping Africa, of course, and the Black Revolution being anti-colonial revolution, the revolution of those on the bottom half of the color line, the oppressed people of the world, people of oppressed nations. So this is from.
When I talk, it's like God is talking, because I never told you guys this, but I'm actually a demigod. I don't like telling people this, but yeah. Shango is my real dad.
Article in the journal Freedom Ways, which is founded by him. Jack Odell, who was a former communist, or former member of the CPUSA, I should say, who had an advisorial role to Martin Luther King Jr. and was cast out of that position due to his communist past, wrote a really influential article in which he states, quote, A people may be colonized on the very territory in which they have lived for generations, or they may be forcibly uprooted by the colonial power from the traditional territory and colonized in a new territorial environment so that the very environment itself is alien to them. In defining the colonial problem, it is the role of the institutional mechanisms of colonial domination which are decisive. Territory is merely the stage upon which these historically developed mechanisms of superexploitation are organized into a system of oppression. So here this gets at the question of potentially the tricky nature of indigeneity with regard to the United States, but also any other place where populations are forcibly dispersed and disposed upon territories. You can't argue that a laborer who was forced to migrate from Angola to Mozambique isn't also colonized, even though they're not in their historical homeland anymore. You can't argue that Nigerian refugees who end up in Germany or in France or in Japan, for that matter, aren't still in a colonial relationship with these new territories. It's the institutional mechanisms of colonial domination, meaning policing, meaning incarceration, meaning subjection in various ways for the purpose of maintaining a political economic system. These are the most important things when it comes to assessing whether a colonial condition exists.
And next we're going to look at a couple quotes from Robert Allen, who just passed away recently, but he was a sociologist that taught in African American studies and in ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. And I'm just going to read one quote here, just a very short one, that I don't know if it adds anything new, but it just drives home the main thesis that we're looking at, which is, quote, "Black America is an oppressed nation, a semi-colony of the United States.
Oh, they took my pyramids
And the
away,
black
fucking
revolt is emerging
crackers.
as a form of national liberation struggle," and in parentheses, otherwise referred to as domestic colonialism. And here also, domestic colonialism could also be substituted with internal colonialism. So in Black Awakening in Capitalist America, which was written in 1969, Robert Allen expands on the definition of internal colonialism to include insights from Kwame Nkrumah's neocolonialism.
If you're looking for any reading recommendations out of this entire podcast, I can't recommend enough Black Awakening in Capitalist America. It's a truly brilliant book. He has this really deep analysis of how white America,
I've got it over here somewhere.
adapted to the threat of black power by creating this
That's what I do when I finish books. I just throw them on the pile. It's a very disorganized system, but it works for me.
He actually has a lot of smoke for Amiri Baraka. At least at the time, Amiri Baraka's politics would evolve and change and shift. And I mean, maybe the critique was a little overstated, but he talks about in particular like Newark and how Newark evolved after the rebellions there to incorporate black subject population into the political architecture of the city without actually granting power to the masses in any sort of way, because we know that power can't be granted in such a way. But in any case, it's a really brilliant book, and we'll put a link to a PDF in the show notes.
Would you recommend that over Nkrumah's neocolonialism?
I think if you're located within America with 3 Ks, it might be easier.
It's interesting how they do this Maoist standard English bit.
And analysis you can bring forward to the present moment, again with Kamala Harris.
Not just Kamala Harris, but what happened with Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
That is none of your business, friend.
It is happening. I mean,
And frankly, what
When somebody tells you something is none of your business, it's probably because the real answer would embarrass the shit out of them.
Which persevered far beyond, but as far as that like mass political moment, you can't argue that this counterinsurgent practice. In fact, shout out to Dylan Rodriguez in the book White Reconstruction. He cites Robert Allen's Black Awakening in Capitalist America to describe what white Reconstruction is from his perspective, the reconstitution of whiteness and hegemony, dominance over the social formation of the so-called United States in a period when it could have collapsed. It could have been.
I think it's on the bookshelf over there.
we put it in the show notes, I think, last week, but recommending Dylan Rodriguez's Live with Millennials of Killing Capitalism on counterinsurgency.
And I would also recommend a much earlier episode on white Reconstruction because he talks a little bit about Allen's influence as well as many other thinkers.
Great, and we'll put those in the show notes. So in 2005, Robert Allen expanded this analysis from 1960. So here he's updating and returning back to the thesis from Kwame Nkrumah about neocolonialism and how white America adapted to the threat of black power. So he writes, quote, "As a result, the white power structure sought to maintain hegemony by replacing direct white control of the internal black colony with indirect neocolonial control through black intermediary groups. Much as in the era of national independence struggles, classic colonialism gave way to neocolonialism in the Third World. Whereas direct white control was the policy of the conservative, segregationist Southern ruling class, indirect neocolonial control was the policy of the liberal white power structure of the North. Neocolonialism
Note
served
that
the
both are
interests
about
of the white power
control.
structure by developing a class of black professionals, politicians.
Neither white liberals or white conservatives. Look, white people in general do not know what's best for black people. I don't know why they keep thinking this. Even some of our democratic socialists think like this. We know what we want, okay? We've known what we wanted since we first set foot in this fucking country. Neither your reform nor your mindless Nayib Bukele type control is going to work. We know what we want. We want full liberation. We want our land and we want our freedom. That's all. We don't want to revenge ourselves. We don't want to reverse enslave people. We don't want to do that because we're not fucked up people like that. But stop acting like you know what's best for us. Stop trying to govern us. Leave us the fuck alone. That's all. Damn. But as we know, imperialists are going to be imperialists unto death.
Bureaucrats, and businessmen, an intermediary class was developed that could be used as a buffer and be co-opted by the white power structure to act on its behalf in controlling African American communities. End quote. And we could update this today to look at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other forms of identity politics operating, as we've already been saying, as counterinsurgency.
And just to kind of run through a couple more exponents of this theory, as early as Martin Delany in 1852 described black people in the United States as a nation within a nation. Du Bois, as early as 1945, spoke of the colonial status of black people within the so-called United States. Kenneth Clark, who has his own interesting sort of history, but in 1965 described so-called urban ghettos as social, political, educational, and economic colonies. And of course, Malcolm X had an evolving analysis of global capitalism and its impact on black people worldwide, black including all third world peoples. Malcolm saw connections between the struggles of black people in the United States, so-called United States, and those of colonized people globally. So
I like how they continue to harp on the point that black means colonized, okay? Black means everybody that's been fucked over by this imperialist system. It's black and anti-colonial are synonymous. I really like that. It puts us basically at the vanguard of global resistance. Because if the United States is the vanguard of global oppression, then it's only dialectically right that the people who have been oppressed here for centuries, us and our indigenous comrades, are going to be the vanguard of destroying it. Of course, we have to live up to that role. We can't just claim it and sit on our asses, of course. That's not going to work.
Moving on from Robert Allen to probably the most schematic or specifically sociological definitions of internal colonialism, one that's often cited in the literature. We have Robert or Bob Blauner, who wrote Racial Oppression in America with 3 Ks. One thing that I remember reading, I read this book for the first time in grad school, and I opened up the first page, and it was dedicated to George Jackson, may his death be avenged.
Oh,
so
Damn, that's hard.
a professor at Berkeley wrote that, which was pretty dope. Unfortunately, later in his life, he became not as good.
many such cases.
But for the purposes of this book, which was published in 1972, he argues based upon 3 assumptions. These 3 assumptions are: racial groups in America are and have been colonized peoples. Therefore, their social realities cannot be understood in the framework of immigration and assimilation that is applied to European ethnic groups. Second, racial minorities share a common situation of oppression from which a potential political unity is inferred. Third, there is a historical connection between the Third World abroad and the Third World within. In placing American realities within the framework of international colonialism, similarities and patterns of racial domination and exploitation are stressed, and a common political fate is implied. So, based upon those 3 assumptions, he argues for a 4-component colonization complex. Again, very sociological. These components are, quote, forced entry into the larger society or metropolitan domain,
Forced entry. I like
subjection to
forced
various
entry.
forms of unfree labor that greatly restrict the physical and social mobility of the group and its participation in the political
Fuck
arena.
off. Leave me alone.
Cultural policy
Damn.
of the colonizer that constrains, transforms, or destroys original values, orientations, and ways of life. And finally, racism, a principle of social domination by which a group seen as inferior or different in alleged biological characteristics is exploited, controlled, and oppressed socially and psychically by a superordinate group. And I think that's a really salient point, and I think something we've been talking about with regard to all of these is racism cannot be seen separately from colonialism. These things are deeply intertwined, and in fact, one could say that racism is a technology of colonialism. But to separate the two things, brings us back to the watering down of racism as in the form of systemic racism, which assumes that you can change the system within, and that frankly, colonized people are even part of that system outside of any that buffer sort of class of people. They are not in any meaningful way responsible for or part of the colonial system itself or the imperial system itself, one might say.
And I wanted to ask you, Nate, how did internal colonialism show up in your academic work? And also a second question, how does it show up in your day-to-day sort of organizing work that you're up to?
So it's interesting. I mean, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later, and we've kind of glanced at it, but the Black Panther Party, at least until Huey Newton posited the theory of intercommunalism, upheld internal colonial theory, upheld the nation within a nation thesis of black people, upheld the black colony thesis. The Young Lords.
Intercommunalism basically holds that there's no such thing as oppressed nations because nations do not exist. It's definitely a manifestation of Huey's idealism. I don't fuck with it. The Revolutionary Intercommunal Black Panther Party, who I have the utmost respect for, does. But that's a point of our disagreement. I mean, I think intercommunalism has its merits. I think I might do a full video on it one day, but I just don't. I agree with Asada. Like Asada said that, wow, Huey should have told the people of Vietnam or the black people in the United States that nations don't exist anymore. Matter of fact, tell the colonizer. Why the fuck would I go to church? I haven't set foot in a church since long before I was old enough to smoke cigarettes. Did you go to church today? Stop getting me off my square, you fuckers. But anyways, intercommunalism it's definitely an interesting theory. It's definitely a product of its time, but I just don't see it making much leeway today. It's Huey's intercommunalism. He did predict the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I find interesting.
Same thing. They were arguing that Puerto Ricans were internally colonized people and formerly colonized people in any case, but particularly if they were living within the so-called United States. The Black Liberation Army, the Republic of New Africa, New African Peoples Organization, so many movements and peoples and like actual people in struggle throughout the so-called United States upheld this analysis. But there's this really strict and stringent separation between the study of race and ethnicity and the study of colonialism because of the methodological nationalism, a lot of the social sciences and liberal arts in the United States. And to the extent that internal colonial theory is brought up, it's in that analogy instead of as an analytic. It becomes this historical curiosity to say, oh, at one point, black people, brown people were looking at their position in the United States and seeing it as similar to people around the world. Isn't that nice? Like, you know, there's international solidarity. But no, we need to think of this as an analytic. And I tried bringing that up in some of my classes, especially after I read Robert Allen's Black Awakening in Capitalist America, which made me, and Blauner's Racial Oppression in America, which made me realize there's actually this rich tradition of heterodox sociology that really attempted to concretely and empirically, to a certain extent, and rigorously analyze the condition of internal colonialism using political economic methods, using ethnographic methods. Blauner was a friend of Huey Newton and actually did this sort of ethnographic study of Huey's political trial to describe how internally colonized people are seen within the legal system. Really fascinating work. And of course, anytime I tried bringing it up, it was something that people couldn't really grapple with because they're not. This conversation was not being had for a very, very long time, and you have these rare exceptions, and hopefully now, unfortunately or not, because of things like decoloniality, but fortunately more so because of October 7th and the growth of attempting to understand anti-colonial struggle and looking back at the history of anti-colonial struggle, people may be more in tune with this analysis. And finally, I did write an article which might be published someday about white anti-imperialists, such as those in the Weather Underground, the May 19th Communist Organization, which we talked about in our first episode.
One is good, one is not so
United
good.
Freedom Front, the Sam Melville, Jonathan Jackson Brigade, many other formations.
At least it didn't include the Symbionese Liberation Army.
Collectivity, this milieu, which were collectivities of white revolutionaries who upheld the political analysis, the praxis of the Black Liberation Army, of the New African Independence Movement. They honored and idolized, in the most positive sense, George Jackson, Assata Shakur, revolutionaries of the Black Liberation Army who were still at that point, late 1970s, early 1980s, to the extent that they had not been incarcerated by the state or murdered. We're still pushing forward that analysis and bringing intellectual production out of the tombs, out of the prisons, which people were circulating in the so-called free world. So anyway, my article is going into and understanding what the subjectivity of white people who aren't anti-racist, but anti-imperialist. And what is that distinction? White anti-racist, that's like what Tim Wise, you know what I mean? White anti-imperialist, you want to destroy the American empire from within. What is it that you're sacrificing when you do that? What is the vision of the world you have when you're doing that? And what are the particular political practices, including armed propaganda, that you're using to instantiate?
Cahokia has declared war on Poland.
So really internal colonial theory is baked into the subjectivity of the people that I'm thinking with and working with.
Yeah, and that paper was accepted, right? You have some edits.
Accepted with revisions, major revisions. But
Accepted
so
by
when it does
revisionists.
go out, we should talk about it.
yeah, absolutely.
And for the second part of the question about how internal colonialism comes up in your day-to-day organizing and day-to-day work, which I know that's intertwined. So.
Yeah, I'm not a part of any formal organizing projects, and at the moment,
It'd be
but
cooler
my
if you
work
were.
in public defense only lays bare the continued colonized nature of Black and brown people in the United States, so-called United States, in the sense that, you know, if you work in a courthouse, if you observe courtrooms, you see one or two white people coming into court who are not judges or cops.
I'll be right
or
back.
Lawyers. It's interesting, actually. Most of the cops in Los Angeles are brown. Many, like most of the cops I see are brown. Most of the guards in the court are brown. Read Dylan's White Reconstruction for some information on the Join LAPD campaign, which I think is a really keen example of neocolonialism in action.
Yeah, I just got pulled over yesterday.
It was a brown cop.
It was a brown cop, yeah, Asian.
Yeah. Yeah.
Registration, anyways, expired.
And so if you work in a courthouse, the lawyers are mostly white, a couple of brown folks, a couple of Black and brown prosecutors. Cops are mostly brown people, but the judges mostly white, a couple brown people, but the clients, the so-called defendants, those being railroaded by the state, 99% of them are Black or brown. There will be one white person for every 99 Black or brown people who are coming in to fight for their lives and fight for their freedom. And I think that's as stark as you can get, because when you see the way the carceral system works and know it to be a colonial system at heart, as a tool of empire acting internally, which disrupts, honestly, the theorizations of some who would argue that Black and brown people within the so-called United States benefit to the same extent from the imperial spoils. As some of you may be listening to this, but I don't think you can really credibly argue it, especially if you live in the United States.
And I wanted to add in an intervention or some thoughts here. that you mentioned, Nate, in passing, you mentioned methodological nationalism. And I think, which I'll just sort of define that, and that's the ways that disciplines take the nation, or the nation state more specifically, as the unit of analysis. So methodological nationalism just presumes the nation as given. And I shouldn't just say the nation. I should that because that's not just the nation state as given, territorially bounded, siloed off. And that's why I'm arguing that there's been a rich history within historical materialism going back from Marx. Samir Amin picks it up. Althusser picks it up. Someone I've been reading more of recently, Hamza Alavi, is a Pakistani Marxist, picks it up. Aijaz Ahmad, who just passed away recently, who also taught at UCI, also an Indian, and lived in Pakistan, Marxist as well. All were building off this idea of the social formation. And I think doing that allows us to look at things that can get flattened when we look at the nation state as our unit of analysis. Obviously, if we're talking about America with 3Ks, and this is that analysis that you were just critiquing, Nate, that like, oh, if you're a brown or a black person or from an oppressed nation inside of America, you're still, America with 3Ks, you're still benefiting from imperialist spoils and are seen the same as an oppressor, like, the same as, I don't know, Jeff Bezos, to use an extreme example, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whatever.
But even then, like, not benefiting as much as the police officer, like the white police officer. If you become a member of that intermediary group, you become part of the neo-colonial administration that puts you in a different subject position. And it would be, obviously, the value flows, the unequal exchange of, how much American currency that black and brown people are paid disproportionately low in does put them a little bit higher within the global imperial order in some sorts of ways. But to argue that everything is flattened and everything is the same is ridiculous.
Yeah. That's a good intervention. So all that to say, I think plugging again, we should be thinking about the social formation, because the state should be seen as a site of struggle and not something that's just taken for granted. As always, this like monolith, but a domain and a site of struggle. And this goes back to the national question, the role of the state, the role of social movements in different articulations of the state.
So recently there's been some more recent articulation. There's been some more recent articulations of internal colonial theory or uses of the theory. I mentioned Sam Klug, Will Kujala, a couple other folks earlier, but also coming from Ball in his work, The Myth of Black Buying Power, in the book I Mix What I Like he wrote, grapples with the theory in really interesting ways. And perhaps more importantly, in the media work he does with Black Liberation Media and on his podcast/videocast stream, I Mix What I Like, constantly brings up internal colonial theory as the analysis through to which to view the black condition, the new African condition in the present day. So shout out to them. So we're moving now to critique, or places that we could begin to think about adaptations that aren't already addressed. And then we'll go into our 8 questions or 9 questions in terms of assessing internal colonial theory, similar to the way Joma did with decolonial theory. So first, I want to talk about a critique that Bob Blauner gave in Racial Oppression in America, where he was kind of self-critiquing in some ways, where he says, quote, "The colonial perspective cannot by itself provide the theoretical framework necessary to grasp the complexities of race relations and social change in America," with 3Ks. "When the colonial model is transferred from the overseas situation to the United States without substantial alteration, it tends to miss the total structure, the context of advanced industrial capitalism in which our racial arrangements are embedded, a context that produces group politics and social movements that differ markedly from the traditional colonial society." So some aspects of that self-critique I do take some issue with, but I think the quote about the context of advanced industrial capitalism add a component that assesses imperialism as being the source of that advancement, so-called advancement, that produces the industry.
And none of these punk motherfuckers declare war on me yet.
And the particular nature
They don't want
of the
the
way
smoke.
that affects, for example, white subjectivity. I think that's an interesting place to think about. The colonial situation can be analyzed in the same sort of way, but again, like we were talking about before, we need to be careful about how we analyze the neo-colonial situation in the United States and how particular material conditions in the United States make it so that the colonial situation, even though it's embedded within this
Nobody
larger
wants to stack up
set
against
of
Nubia.
colonial relations under empire in this colonial imperialist capitalist world system, that I think to bring it back to the world systems piece as well and the social formation piece Joma was talking about, we need to analyze the United States as as a social formation, as part of broader social formations, and
I found Black Awakening in capitalist America, by the way. It's all the way back there.
System, and when you look at the colonial relations that occur differentially, but all as part of the same world system, there emerges some complexities.
Yeah, I think even
I know I have these books, I just can't find them right away.
I'm not taking issue or not serious issue with it, but I think there's some like overstating or like flattening of like what quote unquote traditional colonial societies look like.
Are you playing Civ 7? Who are you playing as?
He's saying basically that we can't look at the context of advanced industrial
Nubian
capitalism
Confucianists.
and like just copy and paste.
This
like,
game just puts
analyses and critiques
anybody together.
from a colonial society or a colonized society, but I think they're not monolithic either. And so there's a level of, to me, generalization.
And I think that's the point, and that's the importance of having a world systemic analysis, of having a global analysis, because even as Blauner had a really great sort of analytic framework for assessing internal colonialism, it was still bound by a certain methodological nationalism that refused to see the whole global context.
Yeah. Because like obviously in a lot of quote-unquote traditional colonial societies, you have compradorial classes, you have colonization look different in different social formations, and so there's a level of flattening happening here.
And colonization took place at the level of a social formation, so it wasn't just one particular nation state or territory, but you had, for example, in the Portuguese colonial social formation, one might say, which incorporated Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde. You have the forced transfer of labor. You have nations which affects the colonial relations of power, which affects the...
Oh, y'all want me to play Bannerlord? Well, I just started playing it on PC, and I got to master the controls so I don't keep getting knocked off my horse in the middle of a battle.
The stratification of the colonial society in a certain sense.
Let's pick on Poland.
I'm not nearly an expert enough to really get into it beyond that, but you have these complexities already occurring, which then you can begin to, like, again, history is best equipped to reward our research, begin to think about those
policies. The workers will inherit a world that has been gutted by climate change, but is still around.
Wholesale to the United States, but think about how those
I'm no prophet.
Can create that complexity which allows for internal colonial analysis to really hold when it comes to the United States.
I am not a prophet. Do not treat me as one.
Here. We wanted to look at Manacaruca's.
I'm not starting my cult yet.
Also, if you haven't,
I'm not starting a cult ever, actually.
Book as well, more recent. And two concepts we want to look at, and this comes from the preface. One is continental imperialism, and the other is counter-sovereignty. And I'm just going to quote him on both these two concepts. It says, first, continental imperialism.
I am fucking starving. I am fucking starving. I want to go see what there is to eat. A blizzard in Nubia? Yeah, it's time to fucking log off. But what you need to remember, what you always need to remember, especially if you are surrounded by electoral people, is that power, political power, grows out of the barrel of a gun, not out of a long ballot. Peace. Go eat. Stop watching.